Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through the next part of the attachment course, which is explanations of attachment. Now, there are two explanations that we need to follow. One is the learning theory, and the other one is going to be bulbing. This video is going to go through the learning theory of attachment. Now, what we find about the learning theory that's really important for us to kind of recognize, you've seen this in the approaches topic, is that learning theory comes from behaviorists, and they would argue that attachment is acquired through learning. So attachment is acquired through learning. And you can see that there's going to be a focus on feeding in terms of this explanation. So if we know that attachment is learned, think about feeding in terms of the unconditional stimulus, unconditional response, association, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response, and take a moment to kind of see if you can come up with a basic understanding of how a baby or a child can become attached to their parent due to the behavioral approach. You might need to think about it, because what's going to be important here is that we use the correct technical terms. Please pause the video at this particular stage to kind of think about what it is that you would put down for each of these terms used in the learning theory. Okay, I hope that you did pause the video and you did think about it, and I've got a brief demonstration via a picture to show you kind of how things would work. Now, a couple of things we need to know is that the food is an unconditioned stimulus. Remember, in terms of kind of things like Pavlov's dogs, he didn't control the fact that the dogs enjoyed eating their meals and produced saliva. Okay, so it's unconditioned in that if somebody's hungry and they eat, they're going to be happy. So the response here is an unconditioned response of a content baby. We also know in this particular picture that the mother is seen as a neutral stimulus. She doesn't produce anything, and so the baby has a non-conditioned response to the mother. Though, of course, because this is classical conditioning, we find that the mother and the milk are produced at the same time. Now, of course, there's a bottle there, but think about it in terms of breastfeeding. There's that mother-milk kind of association that happens repeatedly. And of course, the baby is content. It has this feeling of being happy, and of course we're associating the mother with that happiness, and ultimately what happens is that the mother becomes a conditioned response because she is associated with the happiness of feeling, and so we see that the ultimate conditioned response is the baby being happy. Now, this is a massive oversimplification of both the learning theory and, of course, potentially how a child can become attached to its mother. But that is what this entire theory is all about. So let's go through this in terms of the particular terms that you would be expected to use. Now, please note that these terms are important. This is how we're going to distinguish between other students and say that we do actually know that this is a learning theory, a learning approach. Remember, they're very scientific and they produce particular kind of phrases in order to say things. So we see that the food must be called the unconditioned stimulus, and it produces a reflex or response of pleasure. Now, of course, we associate the mother with this pleasure, and so she becomes a conditioned stimulus. Eventually, she is the source of pleasure herself, and we have a conditioned response of the baby being happy. Now, what I have written kind of here at the end, and I'm going to highlight it, is actually a very important aspect of how we need to talk about this. We are trying to use the learning theory to understand how a baby becomes attached. So we've got to say something along the lines, it's this association between the individual and a sense of pleasure where the attachment bond forms. Okay, so that there's got to be something, there's got to be some kind of back and forth kind of reaction to the mother being there and producing food. And of course, I haven't gone through pages and pages of content. I've actually just spoken just very briefly about a few things. And so that's what we need to make sure that we use the correct terms. It's also another reason why potentially this theory is called cupboard love theory, kind of superficial, kind of this idea that you only love the mother because she produces the food, and that you won't love her if she doesn't produce the food. But there we go. That is the classical condition explaining how a child becomes attached to the mother. Now what we find actually is that there's actually more than one explanation that we could use here. So the first one was classical conditioning. The next one could be operant conditioning. Now I've divided operant conditioning into two parts. And I feel that if you were writing an essay on this, that you perhaps need to talk about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and you don't necessarily need to go through all three explanations. So in terms of operant conditioning, the key word here now is reinforcement. And as such, we need to kind of make sure that we do refer to this particular term. So what is the behavior that gets reinforced in order for attachment to happen? Well, what happens when a baby cries? Okay, this causes the baby's crying because it's experiencing some kind of discomfort. And of course, a baby crying is an incredibly difficult thing to listen to. So what happens is that particular form of reinforcement leads to a response from the caregiver. The caregiver actually responds to the baby crying, and so they may actually feed the child. So once again, food becomes quite important here. And so of course, what we find here, it says here, as long as the caregiver provides the correct response, the crying is reinforced. So in other words, every time the baby cries and the mother is able to respond correctly. Now, of course, this has perhaps got no direct link to caregiver-infant interactions and this idea that potentially you need to be sensitive to the child's needs. But of course, there's something there that you respond because the baby's crying. There's something that's causing the baby to cry, so therefore it causes the correct response. So this happens repeatedly. So what we find then, the baby starts directing its cry for comfort towards a caregiver, saying, "I'm crying, come and feed me," kind of idea. And of course, the caregiver also has kind of social suppressors or comforting behavior that kind of makes the child kind of become picking up, kind of cuddling, kind of changing its nappy, kind of doing all those types of things happening at the same time. So this form of reinforcement is obviously two-way. The baby is reinforced because it's kind of got what it's wanted, because it can only communicate via crying. But of course, at the same time, it reinforces the adult caregiver because it kind of stops crying, and so therefore they're escaping something unpleasant. Okay, so therefore it's called negative reinforcement. So this kind of is the classic understanding that that there's this stimulus response, kind of this punishment versus pleasure type of response that we might find within classic and operant conditioning. So this, of course, once again, is the important statement that we need to look at. The idea that if we don't talk about some kind of form of attachment, we haven't answered the question. So it says the interplay of mutual reinforcement strengthens an attachment bond. So every time the mother responds to the child's kind of needs, and every time the child then is soothed, then there's this interplay between that reinforcement and attachment is formed. So also, once again, it's not meant to be overly complex. It's just simply taking what you've learned in approaches and kind of talking about the behavior being attachment behavior. Of course, the key focus in both particular situations has also just simply been food. Now, of course, this was a suitable understanding for most people, and the learning theory is something which has been taught and people have spoken about for a long time. In order to try and make this particular theory a little bit more concrete or a little bit more kind of complex, we can turn to Dollard and Miller. So this is, I would almost argue, my third way of trying to use the learning approach to try and understand attachment. The first approach was classical conditioning. The second approach was operant conditioning. And now we have a kind of a combination of both, where we see that Dollard and Miller try to kind of break down some of this understanding of kind of what happens to the child. Okay, so they spoke about hunger being a drive. Okay, so of course this is similar to operant conditioning, saying that the child is kind of unhappy, and as such, it kind of does something about it. And so, of course, this doing something about it, this urgency to kind of stop being hungry, is a drive. Okay, and then Dollard and Miller explained or expressed that hunger and thirst are primary drives. Now, of course, just a recognition at this particular stage that babies only feed off milk. Okay, infants, kind of, I'm talking kind of for the first few months of their lives, they're only drinking breast milk or some kind of formula. There's nothing else to it. They don't get supplemented with water as well. So thirst is quite important. So this is a primary drive, and the reason it's primary is because it's essential for survival. So if they're not fed, they're going to die. Okay, so we need to kind of bear that in mind. So it says that when the infant is fed, the drive is reduced, and this is rewarding. So in other words, this primary drive kind of creates within the child this discomfort of there's something wrong. They need food, they need something in order to kind of survive. And of course, as their hunger increases, that this drive kind of makes them feel kind of worse and worse. And of course, if they then are fed, it's this reduction of that is rewarding. I think we've all kind of had that experience before of kind of being incredibly hungry and then being satisfied by the food. Okay, so therefore we then say that food is a primary reinforcer. So every time it has food, it feels better, so it becomes a primary reinforcer. Okay, so what happens, it's a primary reinforcer because it enables the child to avoid discomfort. Now, of course, what happens is we see that the baby is fed about 2,000 times in the first year of its life. Now, of course, when I first saw this figure, I thought this was quite ridiculous. But if you think about it, kind of babies often in the first couple of weeks of their lives will be feeding every 3 to 4 hours. Okay, and then of course, even as they get older, they at least kind of being fed kind of 3 times. And then, of course, they might move on to kind of solids and milk. And of course, there's kind of hundreds of times within a week that they are ultimately being fed. Okay, so of course what happens, there's another reinforcer, and we call this a secondary reinforcer, because it's this association between the person who is producing or giving them the pleasure and the response that they feel. Okay, so we say the mother at this particular stage is that person. So every time they have this reduction in their primary need and feel better, the mother is present. Okay, and so of course what we find is that attachment, it says here, is then a secondary drive. So in other words, it ends up being quite important to the child to be attached to something or to someone in order to make sure that their primary drive is satisfied. So that's why attachment becomes important at a particular stage. Okay, so each of those explanations obviously have very kind of small amount of actual words to use, and so this is a particular area of psychology that you have to be quite precise and make sure you kind of say exactly what it is that you want to say. And that is it. That's the explanation for the learning explanation for attachment. So moving on to the evaluation side of things, I have a question there. It says, what do we already know that can give us evidence that learning theory is flawed? Okay, just think back on maybe some of the stuff we saw with Harlow. Maybe think back of some of the things we saw in terms of kind of Schaffer and Emerson, or any of those type of things. Do we know anything already? Think about the role of the father. Think about those types of things, because this is something which is kind of obviously can be seen clearly by examiners and by teachers like myself, but I kind of want you to see this as well, that obviously the course puts everything into boxes, and we need to kind of make sure that sometimes we kind of move kind of around that and see the whole picture. So you really do know some of these evaluation points without kind of fully thinking about it. So I'm going to go through them with you. Okay, the first one comes from this idea that food is the key motivator for attachment. Okay, think about kind of what evidence do we know that kind of suggests that food is not a key motivator for attachment. Okay, of course, it's Harlow. Harlow showed us that contact comfort is more important than food. He gave those babies a choice, monkeys raised in captivity, a choice between contact comfort and food, and they chose contact comfort all the time. So that's why I have that particular statement there. It says they observed newborn baby monkeys showed more attachment to a toweling mother which provided contact comfort than a Y mother that provided food. Okay, so these are both indicators of attachment, that they would prefer to spend time on the contact comfort. And we see the second one here says they chose as a base to run to when frightened. Both of those being quite good indicators that they would choose contact comfort over food. Another one we can turn to is Schaffer. Schaffer said that infants eat to live rather than live to eat. Active seekers of stimulation rather than passive recipients of food. Very kind of lovely thing to say, especially, maybe a few mothers might not feel this when they kind of are tired and kind of often feeding their babies and kind of not feeling appreciated in many ways. Babies are active seekers of stimulation. We saw this in the caregiver-infant interaction. Active seekers of stimulation. So we know that actually the learning theory is not a suitable theory to explain why attachment happens, because it simply says that attachment develops as a result of being fed. Okay, so food is not that important. We see so many kind of pieces of information that says that food are not that important. So the second point is also kind of linking into this idea that food is not always important, but this is now looking at the person who provides food and saying, well, okay, so if it was just about food, it would always be the mother who provides food. But we know, for example, from Schaffer and Emerson, that they saw that sensitivity was actually important. It was not time spent with the baby, it was not anything other than sensitivity. And this was kind of demonstrated by the fact that at least 39% of the infants had their fathers as primary attachment figures, and these are fathers who would not have fed the children. The children were primarily breastfed at this particular point. So of course Schaffer and Emerson, Harlow, and all these kind of statements are kind of about kind of other things that are necessary for attachment, just highlight the weakness in the learning theory and suggest that there's more to attachment than simply food. Now, of course, we do have a few other issues here. Now, I know that this particular point is not particularly clear. Now, the reason I have this is because I do at least acknowledge that as human beings, we do respond to learning theory. It's a very powerful drive within us. And you'll be surprised often of the many things that we do actually end up learning through our lives. And so I kind of wanted to kind of allow you to kind of say, well, actually, there is learning in our attachment behavior, but it's not the most important thing. And so, of course, when I used to kind of say it as a positive, as a strength, people used to often put that point first, but I kind of really want you to kind of have it last. Okay? I want to say it is still credible that an association between primary caregiver and the provision of comfort and social interaction is part of what builds their attachment. So I do feel that attachment is kind of built up through having that positive association, that positive reinforcement between mother and child. Okay, but we find that attachment needs to be explained as a kind of a more complex. So in year 13 we'll go through some issues and debates, and one of them would be reductionism. So this is behavioral reductionism, looking at this idea we simply attach to our mothers because of that kind of that learned kind of association or classic conditioning or reinforcement. But I kind of want you to kind of see that we need to kind of look to other things. It could be the interaction between mother and child. It could be sensitivity. It could be a whole host of things that ultimately lead to attachment. So there we have have it, all the points that we need to do. So of course, when I'm talking about that reductionism, we always talk about other factors, okay? And we saw this in caregiver interactions, that attention, responsiveness are important in terms of the child. So if I'm never respond to my child, if it kind of has all these needs and I'm unable to kind of see them, the child is probably not going to be primarily attached to me in this particular stage. And that's it. Not meant to be a complex topic, certainly is all we kind of need to do at this particular stage. Just to kind of finish this off, there is a question that says here, outline research findings that challenge the learning theory. That's just literally my evaluation points. And we also, that's it. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it's interesting for you to have a look at, and I shall continue teaching you through the other videos and look at the Bowlby's theory of explanation next. Thank you.